The door was already open when I reached my apartment that night, and she was standing inside it. I barely knew my neighbor, just the hallway nods you give when you are both too tired to stop. But her parents were on their way up the stairs, and she looked at me like I was the only person who could save her. So she told them I was her fiancé, and I, without even realizing it, said yes. What started as one terrified evening turned into a weekend of pretending, and somewhere in it, I stopped being able to tell what was real. Let me back up, because that night only makes sense if you know the quiet I was living in. My name is Nate, I'm 31, and I work the morning shift at a small print shop a few blocks from my place, the kind of work that asks for steady hands and not much talking. For a long time that suited me fine. I'd set up the orders, check the machines, and listen to the press hum while the city woke up. By the time I walked home, my hands smelled like ink and warm paper. Most evenings I heated up leftovers, read a few pages of something, and let the silence settle over the apartment like a second roof. For a while, that was enough. Or I told myself it was. I live on the third floor of a narrow building with 6 apartments, and one slow elevator I never bother with. The walls are thin enough that I can hear my neighbor's door close and know she's home before I reach my own. I've been here 3 years. I know which floorboards complain underfoot, where the light falls at 4 in the afternoon, and which corner of the kitchen stays cold no matter how high I turn the heat. It's a small life, but it's mine, and I had gotten good at not wanting more than that. Her name is Charlotte. She moved in across the hall about a year ago, and I noticed her the way you notice a change in the light, without meaning to, and without any right to. Long brown hair, a soft laugh I sometimes heard through the wall, the kind of easy warmth that made the hallway feel less like a hallway for half a second. We never really talked. We did that thing neighbors do, the small nod, the half smile, the quiet, hey, that means I see you and I'm not going to stop. Once she held the front door when my arms were full, and I said thank you, and she said of course, and that was the whole of it. I replayed it that night, which tells you more about me than about her. When she moved in, our building manager asked each of us to leave a spare key with the neighbor across the hall, in case of a leak or a locked-out night. I'd left mine with Charlotte, and she'd left hers with me. I never used it, not once, but I kept it in the drawer by my bed, and sometimes I'd think about that small piece of metal sitting there and feel something I didn't have a name for. 2 doors, 2 keys, 2 people who had handed each other a way in and then never used it. I didn't know it then, but that little key was about to matter more than I could have guessed. I'm not lonely in some big dramatic way. The phone just doesn't light up much after 9, and sometimes the quiet gets so loud I leave the radio on just to have another voice in the room. I had talked myself into believing the solitude was a choice, and not a slow habit I'd fallen into. I almost believed it too, right up until the evening I came home with a bag of groceries and found her standing in my living room. After that, the quiet never fit the same way again. It was a Tuesday, and it had rained all day, the kind of steady gray rain that soaks into your mood by the afternoon. I came up the stairs with a grocery bag cutting into my fingers, thinking about soup and nothing else. The hallway light flickered the way it always did, and I was already rehearsing my small, uneventful evening when I saw my door. It stood open, not broken open, just a few inches wide, with the light from inside spilling out into the hall. My first thought was that I'd forgotten to lock up, except I never forget. My second thought was that something was wrong. I pushed the door with my elbow and stepped in, and there she was, Charlotte, standing in the middle of my living room, holding a glass of water she'd poured herself from my kitchen like she belonged there. She looked up, and the relief on her face was so raw it almost knocked me over. She said my name, just my name, and then she started talking fast, too fast for me to follow. Something about her parents, something about a visit, something about how sorry she was. I set the groceries on the counter because my hands had gone strange, and I didn't know what else to do with them. And then I heard the footsteps on the stairs. Her parents were climbing up, and they were close. I could hear her mother's voice floating up the stairwell, bright and curious, asking which floor Charlotte lived on. Charlotte's eyes went wide, and she looked at me with something I can only describe as panic wearing the mask of a plea. She said she would explain everything, she promised, but she needed me to trust her for one night. Just one night. I didn't have time to ask a single question. A knock came, the door swung wider, and there they were, an older couple with kind faces and travel bags, smiling at their daughter and then at me. Charlotte moved before I could. She crossed to me, took my hand, and held it up next to hers, and I saw the thin ring on her finger, a simple band I'd never noticed before. She told them I was the man she was going to marry. She said it clearly, the way you say something you've rehearsed in the shower 100 times. And she squeezed my hand once, hard, like she was holding on to the edge of a cliff. Her mother put a hand to her chest, and her father's eyebrows lifted, and then they were both smiling, really smiling, the kind of joy that made my chest ache, because I knew it wasn't mine to receive. And I heard my own voice answer before I could catch it. I told them my name, and that it was true, and that we were engaged. I said all of it without even realizing I was saying it, and the words hung in the air like they had always belonged there. The next thing I knew, we were across the hall in Charlotte's apartment, sitting around her small table with candles lit. There was more food than she could have cooked in an hour. She must have been planning this dinner for days, or else her parents had brought half of it in those travel bags. Her mother kept touching my arm and calling me son, and her father poured me a glass of something amber and asked me questions about my work. I answered every one while Charlotte's foot pressed against mine under the table. I think it was her way of saying, "Stay with me," and also her way of saying she was sorry. It did not feel like nothing, and that is the part I keep coming back to. We had to tell the story of how we met, and Charlotte started it while I studied the grain of the table and tried to look like a man in love instead of a man in shock. She said we'd kept bumping into each other in the hallway, which was true, and that one night I'd carried her groceries up because the elevator was out, which was a kind lie. She made me sound patient and steady, the sort of man who shows up, and I could feel myself turning into that man a little as she described him. Her mother teared up, and her father nodded slowly, the way fathers do when they're deciding whether to believe a story, and I couldn't tell if I'd passed or not. The strange thing was the parts that weren't pretending. When I reached for the salt, Charlotte passed it before I had to ask, like she'd been watching my hands all night. When her father pressed me on wedding plans, she jumped in with a detail about a small ceremony in the fall that she'd clearly invented on the spot. It came out so warm I almost forgot she was making it up. Little things slipped past the act, small kindnesses that had no audience and no reason, and each one landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I kept telling myself it was a performance. My chest didn't seem to care what I kept telling it. Her father studied me across the candles, and the warmth in the room thinned out for a moment, until I felt the real weight of what we were doing. Here were two good people who had come a long way to meet the man their daughter was going to marry, and the man they were meeting didn't exist yet. I looked at Charlotte, and she looked back, and for half a second the mask slipped, and I saw how scared she was underneath it. Then she smiled at her mother, and the moment passed, and the dinner went on. But I carried that half second out of the room with me, the way you carry a coal cupped in your hands, careful not to let it go out. After dinner, her parents said their goodnights and retreated to the small guest room Charlotte had set up at the back of her apartment. The second the door clicked shut, the air in the room changed completely. Charlotte sank onto the edge of her couch and put her face in her hands, and I stood there holding a dish towel I'd picked up for no reason. I was looking at the woman I was supposedly going to marry, waiting for the world to make sense again. She looked up, and she looked smaller than she had across the table, like the performance had been holding her up and now it had let her down. She said she was so sorry, and she said it 3 times before I told her to just start at the beginning. So she told me. Her parents had been worrying about her for years, ever since a long relationship of hers ended badly and she moved to the city to start over. They wanted her settled, and they'd been pushing, gently at first and then not so gently. And somewhere in the middle of all that worry, she had told them she was seeing someone. Then she'd told them it was serious, and 2 months ago she'd told them she was engaged, just to make the pushing stop. She never meant for it to go this far. She said she'd been planning to end the story quietly, to say it fell apart, but then they called and said they were coming to meet him, and she ran out of room to undo it. I should have been angry. A reasonable person would have been angry. Instead, I sat down on the other end of the couch and I understood her. The way you understand a person who has dug a small hole that keeps getting deeper the more they try to climb out. She hadn't set out to deceive anyone. She'd told one soft lie to protect herself from the people she loved most, and the lie had grown teeth while she wasn't looking. I asked her how long they were staying. She said through the weekend, 4 more days, and then they'd go home. 4 days. I could feel the number settle over us like a sentence. We made the deal there, on her couch, in the low light, with her parents asleep 1 wall away. I would be her fiancé for the weekend, steady and believable and close enough to pass. We'd share the meals, hold the story together, use the small words in front of them and drop them when they weren't around. When the weekend ended, we'd end the engagement quietly, the way she'd always planned to, and no one would get hurt. She said it like a promise, and I said yes like a man agreeing to a loan he already knows he can't repay. We shook on it with her hand still warm from the dinner she'd cooked for a fiancé she'd invented. I went back across the hall to my own apartment at midnight, and the quiet there was different, charged, like the air before a storm. The next morning it began in earnest, and the first thing I learned was that pretending is harder than it looks when the people watching actually love you. Charlotte's mother wanted coffee together, all 4 of us, at the little table with the morning light coming through the window. She wanted to hear everything about us all over again. Charlotte and I sat side by side with our shoulders touching when we reached for the sugar, and I found myself timing my breathing to hers without thinking about it. Her father asked how I'd proposed, and the table went quiet, and I felt the floor open up under me because we had never agreed on this part. Charlotte saved me. She said I'd taken her to the little park near the building, the one with the bench by the trees. She said I'd been so nervous I'd dropped the ring and she'd had to pick it up herself. Her mother laughed until she wiped her eyes, and her father clapped me on the shoulder, and the lie slid past them so smoothly it almost sounded true. That was the pattern of the days. We ate together, walked together, told the story of us together, and somewhere in the middle of it, the seams between the pretending and the truth started to blur at the edges. She'd reach for my hand crossing the street and forget to let go once we'd reached the other side, and I'd let her forget, and neither of us said a word about it. We made up a history, a first date at a noodle place down the block, a second one in the rain. The details we invented started to feel less invented because we were discovering them as we went. The closer we sat, the easier the words came, and the easier the words came, the harder it got to remember they weren't real. Once, walking back from the park, her mother asked how we'd picked our apartment. Charlotte said we'd wanted to be close to each other, but not too close, which made her father laugh and say that was the secret to a good marriage. I laughed too, and the laugh surprised me, because it was real, and because for a second I forgot there was a deal at all. Late on the second day, it almost fell apart. Her mother found me alone in the kitchen washing dishes, and she asked me, very gently, what Charlotte was like when no one was watching. She said she'd been trying to get a read on me, and she wanted to know if I really saw her daughter. It was the most dangerous question anyone had asked me all weekend, because the honest answer was that I was starting to. I told her that Charlotte was quieter than people thought, that she carried her worry close to her chest, that she laughed more than she let on. Her mother looked at me for a long time, and then she said that was exactly right, and she patted my hand and left the kitchen. I stood there with the water running over my fingers and my heart going fast, because I hadn't been describing the woman I was pretending to love. I'd been describing the woman I listened to through the wall every night, and her mother had heard the difference I didn't mean to show. That night, after her parents turned in, I sat on my own couch and tried to add up what was happening to me. In a year of hallway nods, I had never known Charlotte the way I'd come to know her in 2 days of lying beside her. The closeness was doing something to the careful quiet I'd built. I was starting to feel like the man she'd described at dinner, patient and steady, the sort who shows up. I couldn't tell anymore whether I was becoming him for her parents or for her. The weekend was half over, and I told myself that was a good thing. The tightness in my chest told me something else entirely. The third evening, her parents went out to visit an old friend of the family, and for the first time all weekend, Charlotte and I were alone together with no one to perform for. We sat on her couch with the windows open and the night air coming in. The silence between us was different from the quiet I knew in my own apartment, warmer, like a room with a fire lit in it. She had her legs tucked under her, and she was turning the thin ring on her finger round and round. I watched her do it and realized I'd been memorizing her hands all weekend without meaning to. She caught me looking, and she didn't pull away, and she didn't fill the silence with anything to fix it. She just let it be there, the way you let a thing be there when you're not ready to name it yet. She told me about the relationship that ended, the one that had started all of this, in the plain way you only talk to someone you've decided to trust. She said she'd been so careful with people for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone close without holding her breath. I told her about my own quiet, about the radio I left on at night, about the years I'd spent turning solitude into a virtue because the alternative scared me. We traded the small, true things people usually keep for later, except there was no later for us. The deal ended Sunday, and maybe that was why it felt safe to say them now. It's strange how a deadline can make a person honest. I thought about all the careful evenings I'd spent on the other side of the wall from her, close enough to hear her laugh and far enough to pretend I wasn't listening. Now she was sitting 2 feet away, telling me the truest thing she knew, and the distance I'd kept for a year felt like the silliest thing I'd ever done. At some point, she leaned her head against my shoulder, just rested it there, light, like she was testing whether the moment would hold. It held, and I could feel the weight of her and the warmth of her through my shirt. I could hear her breathing slow, the way it does when a person finally stops bracing for something to go wrong. I put my hand over hers, the one with the ring, and she turned her palm up and laced her fingers through mine. We sat like that without a word for what felt like a long time. There was no audience and no reason to pretend, and that was the moment I understood I wasn't pretending anymore. The understanding landed in me so quietly it was almost gentle, like something settling into the place it had always been meant to go. Later, at her door, a kiss happened, small and careful, and over almost before it started, the kind that asks a question rather than answering one. She pulled back and looked at me, and I could see her trying to decide what to call it, whether to fold it back into the act or let it stand on its own. She didn't say anything. She just said goodnight, softly, and closed the door between us, and I stood in the hallway hearing the lock turn, with my heart doing something it hadn't done in years. I went back to my apartment, and the wall between us was thin as ever, and I pressed my hand to it like I could feel her on the other side. I didn't know if she felt it too, or if she was still acting, or if she was lying on her own couch right then, asking herself the same thing. The not knowing was the part that undid me. The last full day of the visit, Charlotte's parents decided to celebrate, and the gentle scrutiny I'd been ducking all weekend turned into something with a shape and a date. Her mother announced over breakfast that they wanted to take us out to dinner that night, a proper engagement dinner, and that her father had something he wanted to say. Charlotte's smile didn't waver, but I felt her foot find mine under the table again, and this time the press wasn't reassurance, it was a warning. 4 days of pretending had been hard enough, and a toast, a speech, a room full of well-meaning attention aimed at a love that didn't exist yet. That was something else. I spent the whole morning with a low hum of dread under my ribs, and the closer evening came, the louder it got. Her father took me aside in the afternoon, while Charlotte and her mother were out picking up a cake. We stood by the window in her apartment, and he asked me, man to man, what my intentions were, and he said it without unkindness, which made it harder. He wanted to know if I was going to take care of her, really take care of her, not just in the way that looks good at a dinner table. I had been ready to improvise, to give him the steady, reassuring answer a fiancé gives, but something about the way he asked it made the rehearsed words leave me. Instead, I told him the truth. I said I'd only known his daughter a short time, but that I'd spent more of it listening than talking, and that I thought she deserved someone who kept listening. I said I wanted to be that person. I said it simply, and I meant every word. And the strange and terrible thing was that the most honest thing I'd said all weekend came out of me in the middle of a lie. He looked at me for a long moment, the way he had over the candles that first dinner, and then he nodded and put his hand on my shoulder and said he was glad. From the doorway, I heard a small sound and I turned, and Charlotte stood there with the cake box in her arms, and she'd heard at least some of it. The look on her face was the one I'd been waiting for, without knowing I'd been waiting, surprised and soft and a little frightened. It was the look of a person realizing the act has gotten away from her. Her mother came up the stairs behind her, chatting about the frosting, and the moment folded itself away. But I carried it with me into the evening like a lit match I had to keep sheltered. At dinner, her father stood up and made the toast. He said he was proud, and he said he could see how his daughter looked at me, and every kind word landed on me like a weight I'd earned and hadn't earned at the same time. Charlotte sat beside me with her hand in mine, and I could feel the fine tremor in her fingers, the cost of being good at this starting to show. She smiled for her parents, the warm, easy smile she'd perfected, but I was close enough now to see what was underneath it, the tiredness and the guilt and the thing she wouldn't name. When the toast ended and everyone raised their glasses, I raised mine too, and I looked at her, and she looked at me. I knew neither of us would make it to Sunday without the truth forcing its way out. The only question left was how it would come. It started that night, after her parents had gone to bed, full and happy, when Charlotte and I stood in her kitchen, and the pressure finally broke the surface. She said we just had to get through tomorrow, one more day, and then it would be over, and everything could go back to normal. I asked her what normal was, exactly. Whether normal meant the hallway nods again, and the closed doors, and the quiet I used to think I liked. She looked at me like I'd moved the rules on her, and maybe I had, but I couldn't help it. The words came out before I could shape them into something safer. She said this was always the plan. I said the plan was made before I knew what it would feel like to hold her hand when no one was watching. That was how we had our first real fight, the first honest thing between us that wasn't shaped for an audience. It hurt more than the pretending ever had. I almost left. I stood at her door with my hand on the knob and my chest tight, and I told myself this was the moment to walk away. I could go back across the hall, lock my door, and let the weekend end early and cleanly before I got in any deeper. The gap between what I felt and what I was allowed to feel had grown too wide to live in, and staying felt like agreeing to a debt I'd never be able to pay. But I didn't leave. I stood there, and I thought about the spare key in my drawer and the thin wall I'd pressed my hand against the night before. I thought about all the small ways she'd already been close to me before any of this started. She'd been one door away for a year, and the pretending had just made me finally look at it. I let go of the knob, and I turned back, and I told her I wasn't going anywhere. But I needed to know if she felt it too, or if I was falling alone inside a plan that meant something different to her. She didn't answer right away. She sat down on the arm of the couch and folded her arms the way people do when they're holding something in. I watched her fight with herself in the quiet of that kitchen. Then she said something that broke my heart a little, which was that the hardest part of all of this was how easy the rest of it had felt. She said she'd spent a year being careful not to need anyone, and that in 4 days I'd walked past every wall she'd built, and that scared her more than her parents finding out ever could. She said it like a confession she was handing over against her will. Then she pulled it back, just as fast, and said we should sleep, and that we'd figure it out after her parents left. I understood that she wasn't ready yet, that the fear had outweighed the feeling for now. I went home and lay in the dark and listened to the building settle, and I didn't sleep. I knew that tomorrow the truth was coming, whether we were ready for it or not. It came the next morning, the way truth usually does, not on our terms, but on its own. Charlotte's mother had gone back into the kitchen early to make coffee, and she'd found the drawer where Charlotte kept the props for the story. Inside were the ring's little box, a printed card with a date on it that didn't match anything, and a notebook page of notes about us that read more like a script than a memory. She didn't accuse. She just sat down at the table with the page in her hands and asked Charlotte, very quietly, what this was. And Charlotte, who had been so steady for 4 days, looked at her mother's hurt face and couldn't hold the shape of the lie anymore. She told her, not all of it at once, but enough, and the rest came out in pieces while her father stood in the doorway and heard it too. I came in from the hallway in the middle of it, carrying nothing, and I knew the second I saw the room that it was over. Her mother was crying, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that's worse, and her father had gone very still in the way that men do when they're deciding whether to be angry or sad. They looked at me then, and I saw the confusion move across their faces, the slow recalculation of a man they'd called son for 4 days, and I couldn't blame them for any of it. I had stood in their daughter's living room and let 2 good people love a version of me that didn't exist, and I had let them be proud of a story that wasn't true. Her father said, very evenly, that he would have rather heard the truth, however hard it was, than been handed a kindness made of lies. It wasn't cruel, and it was worse than cruel, because it was right. Charlotte's mother asked me, gently, why I'd gone along with it, and I told her the truth. Charlotte had been frightened, and I'd wanted to help. And I'd stayed because somewhere in the middle of helping, I'd stopped wanting to leave. That answer didn't fix anything, and it just sat there in the room with the rest of the hurt, and I could see it didn't change what I'd been a part of. I stepped back. I told them I was sorry, and I meant it down to the floor. Then I went back across the hall to my own apartment, closed the door, and stood in the quiet I'd spent 3 years curating. This time the silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like the shape of someone missing, and I stayed there for a long time before I could move. I didn't blame Charlotte. I understood why she'd done it, the way you understand a person who lights a small fire to keep warm and watches it climb the curtain. The understanding was the part that made the distance between us ache the most. She hadn't meant for any of it to happen, and neither had I. But understanding doesn't undo what's been done. By the afternoon, her parents had packed their bags and gone, and the building was quiet again, and the door across the hall stayed closed. I sat at my kitchen table with the radio off for the first time in years because I didn't want another voice in the room anymore. I wanted hers, and it wasn't there, and the evening stretched out long and empty. 2 days passed, and then 3, and the quiet went on being the wrong shape. I went to work and came home and heated up leftovers and did all the things I'd always done, except now every one of them had a hole in the middle of it where she used to be. I'd hear a door close in the hallway, and my whole body would turn toward it before I could stop myself. Then, it wouldn't be hers, and I'd stand there with the disappointment settling over me like something physical. The old Nate, the one who'd been good at not wanting more, would have let it go and filed it under a strange weekend and a kind mistake. But I wasn't that man anymore, and I knew it the way you know a season has turned, not because of one moment, but because the air had changed and there was no changing it back. On the 4th evening, I did the thing the old me never would have done. I didn't knock because a plan required it, and I didn't knock because someone was watching. And I knocked because I wanted to, and that was the whole reason, and it was the scariest single reason I'd ever had. She opened the door and she looked tired, and she looked like she'd been crying recently. When she saw me, she looked like she'd been hoping I'd come, and trying not to hope at the same time. I didn't have a speech ready. I just told her, standing in the hallway with my hands at my sides, that the pretending had stopped being pretending a long time before the weekend ended, and that I was done pretending I didn't want this for real. I said it simply, the way her father had asked me to say things, plainly, without a performance around it. I let the words stand on their own, the way she'd let the silence stand that night on the couch. She met me there. She said the hardest part of the lie had been how easy the rest of it felt. The same words from the kitchen, only this time she didn't pull them back. She said she'd spent the days since her parents left trying to talk herself out of it and failing, and that the failing was the thing that finally convinced her. She reached for my hand, and I took it, and this time there was no audience to perform for and no deadline ticking down behind us. We were just 2 people standing in a hallway, choosing each other with nothing left to hide behind. I told her I didn't want to pretend anymore, and I didn't want to stop either. She said she didn't want to stop either, and she said it like she meant it down to the floor. And I believed her the way you believe something you've already known for days. We told her parents the truth, all of it, the parts we'd hidden and the part that had grown up in the middle of the hiding. It wasn't easy and it wasn't tidy, but it was honest, and they could feel that. Her father listened for a long time before he said anything. When he did, he said he was glad we'd found the real thing, even if the road to it had been a strange one. Her mother cried again, only this time it was the other kind. There was a ring later, a real one, chosen together on an ordinary afternoon, with no story attached to it yet. The thin band she'd worn for the weekend went back into the drawer where the script had lived. The new ring fit the way the spare key had always fit, like something that had been waiting in the right place the whole time. The thin wall between our apartments feels different now. Some nights I hear her moving around on the other side, the small sounds of her evening. Instead of loneliness, what I feel is the opposite, the warmth of knowing she's right there, one door and a few steps away. I stopped leaving the radio on because I don't need another voice in the room when I already know where to find hers. The door across the hall doesn't close between us anymore, and the quiet I kept for years turned out to be just making room for her to walk into it. If my story warmed your heart, leave a comment below and tell me which moment got you the most, and stay close, because the next one's already on its way.